You are now locked into Radio Juxtapoz, the home of contemporary art and culture conversation. Coming up today.
You know when little kids are at that stage where they draw a giant head and it just has arms and legs sticking out of it, but there's no body? I had drew like at least 15 of them, as big as I could, which was life size for like a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, on my wall. And I remember I told my mother those were my guardian angels, so she let me keep them there.
This is Radio Juxtapoz. It's been a big year for New Jersey quilt maker Bisa Butler. From a museum show at the Cantoa Museum of Art to featuring as the fall 2020 cover artist for Juxtapoz magazine. But for her, this was all just a matter of time. Bisa's work is the reinvention of traditional quilt making, a craft passed through history as a way of preserving it. Through fabrics and photographs, she moves to the uncertain future while celebrating the untold past. She is part storyteller, part historian, and will do a much better job of talking about her work than I will. So let's not waste any time and get on with the interview. As always, thanks for listening to Radio Juxtapoz. This episode is a recording of a conversation between Bisa Butler and Evan Pricco, and was recorded observing about 3,000 miles of social distancing. If you enjoy this, make sure you subscribe to the channel and let us know in the socials. Enjoy the episode.
Okay, so first things first, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. That cover, holy moly. It is so beautiful. She is so gorgeous. Like, it was actually shocking. I don't know, even though it's my piece, but I think your lettering and the way the yellow and the way her like afro, you could see through the flowers. It's just so gorgeous.
It's amazing because sometimes, you know, you hunker down and you do a magazine, and then when it gets out into the real world, you kind of like separate yourself from it. And for some reason, I've sort of separated myself from it, where when I see it, I feel refreshed every time I see it, which is nice. It's a good feeling to have.
You have to do that, I bet. Otherwise, you're like too close to it, right?
No, but like, how do you feel like when you go into your own gallery show or a museum and you see your work? Do you separate yourself from it, or are you like, is it yours and you're kind of like, I want to come back to me? Like, do you separate yourself a little bit?
I do, only because I can never really see my work as it really should be. My living room is only 9 feet high. And my last piece was 12 feet. So it was hanging on the floor, and then it just looks so much bigger. I can't even stand back far enough to really see the work. So when I see it in a museum or a gallery, it's just a whole nother thing. It's like I'm seeing it with new eyes. And especially like at a museum show, I may not have seen that piece for like a year or whatever. And so I feel like it's like revisiting old friends, but it's trippy. It's trippy because they always somehow look better to me. I'm like, wow, like I'm happy that I'll notice things that I did at the last minute, like add a ring. My last, the piece that's on your cover, I gave her like a toe ring and her bracelets, like little things like that. I'm like glad that I put those details.
Yeah. Well, okay, so that's actually a really good place for people to start too here, is that you actually, at times when you're making the work, you don't even know what the final, like, you don't get that opportunity to take a step back like you're painting a painting in a studio. You kind of have to trust that you're doing the right thing. And like, how does an error come? Like, if you make an error, like, how do you fix that? Like, yeah, how does that stuff work out?
An error is so costly because it's not like I can just paint over it.
Right.
Sometimes I can feel an error happening in a face, and I'm like, this, because I usually start out with the image, right? Just the visage. Yep. And I'm like, this, sometimes it's not coming out right, but then the next day I see that it's coming out good. But I can work for 3 days on a face and then be like, I'll come down one morning, because I work right in my home. My dining room is my work studio, and right now I'm sitting in my sewing studio, which was formerly the study in the house.
Okay.
But I'll look at it and be like, this is hideous. I can't.
Wait, what? Okay, so what's hideous though?
No, just hideous. Like this one, I felt like her head looked like a sledgehammer. I mean, really hideous. Wrong color combinations. They just look ugly. I don't know. Sometimes they look like they're angry. I don't know how to explain how how a person can be hideous to you. Imagine you're walking and you see somebody, you're kind of shocked, like, wow, this is interesting because this person is not that pleasant to look at. Sometimes my pieces are that bad that I have to just start again. I'm mad as hell. And I'm like, I wasted all this time and I have a deadline. I don't have time for this. But the second time I do it, then it's like, it just feels so much better right from the start.
How many times per quilt do you go like, why do I sew as opposed to paint? I mean, do you have those moments? Because you do pick you have a very laborious process, and what you do is so time intensive. Not to say painting is not, but errors can be fixed in painting in different ways. So do you often go, yeah, I've kind of picked an interesting medium here?
If I have a piece where there's a lot of ruffles or lace, or like I did a piece with a guy, an elderly man, his pants were very wrinkled. And I didn't think about it originally. The source photo was a man in 1940s, and he was outside and his pants were like a little wrinkled, but it was high sun, so high contrast. And as I put that together, I was just like, why did I do this? Like, every single wrinkled line in those pants was something that I had to cut and lay. And then the stitching of it, I'll do that too. I'll do something, I'm trying to think of something. Imagine like somebody has like a houndstooth jacket on. You know, like houndstooth jacket print?
Yep.
So I could just stitch around it, right? Or make like a few loops in the pattern. Sometimes I'll get in there and I'll start making these little zigzags in the houndstooth. And then I'm like, why did I start this? Because now his entire jacket, I have to go across with these micro stitches, but I've already begun it. So like, that's the times when I just like shake my head at myself, like, oh my God, what did I get into? There's no backing out and I already started it.
When you get into those situations, do you have an artist or inspiration that you kind of go back to and be like, this is how they would have dealt with it, or this is how so-and-so would have fixed this problem? I mean, do you have like that person for you?
I'm trying to think, maybe not so much, but I think just in general, on late nights and early mornings, or like if I have a crazy deadline and I have to do 10 pieces. Let's say I had to do 10 pieces in a short period of time. I do think about like Charles White and Alma Thomas and Lois Jones, Romare Bearden. I think Romare Bearden was he working at food stamps at first? I think he was like a social worker. And I think about Jacob Lawrence, although he was more successful younger. But I just think, like, how can I really complain when I get to do my art full time? And I think about, like, Romare Bearden going up, helping poor people in Harlem with their food stamps, but then he's still doing his artwork. So, like, that helps me check my whole, like, privilege. Like, you get to go to your dining room and do your work. So, stop it.
We're in an interesting era where artists are living and famous at the same time, which is something that I think social media has helped a lot. Like most artists, a lot of their fame comes at the end when they've kind of had their retrospectives and all these things, and they're in their 60s or 70s or 80s. But like you are at an age where you're having success in museum shows at a younger age and can appreciate it in a different way. Do you ever think about that?
I do. I actually try to fashion my career after the artists who had their success when they were alive. Like, that's one
Yeah.
of the main things that I look at. Like how I mentioned Jacob Lawrence and Ramir Bearden. They both had success when they were alive, but Jacob Lawrence was successful at, I think, 21, 22.
Yeah.
Right. He was a star from the get-go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And then I did hear like how that affected him mentally. Like there were times where he had emotional breakdowns because of that pressure. So in a way, I'm grateful that I am in my 40s and that I don't know what I would have been like if this happened at 21. I don't know. I mean, maybe I would have been fine, or maybe I would have just been ridiculous. It's really hard to know. But like I love Basquiat, and I feel like he was so young and
Right.
he didn't have time to adjust to this. I mean, his fame was through the roof, but at that young age, how many of us would have been able to handle that appropriately,
Absolutely.
and not live life so riskily? It is true that you think you're invincible when you're young, but I deliberately try to look at artists like, I love Elizabeth Catlett because I feel like she lived and worked and had recognition and had a family. I love Faith Ringgold because she's still living and she's almost, I think she's 91 now. Let me not call out her age if she doesn't want that to happen. But
a Google search is just one step away.
I know. But, as I get older, when people do that to me, I'm like, no, like, why'd you do that? So, but I do deliberately try to, like, walk in the footsteps of those people who were able to have success while they were alive.
This has been, for so many reasons, this has been a weird year. Everything is just, it's like, the script couldn't have been written. There's like nobody in Hollywood could have written how this year would have played out. And whether it's pandemic, whether it's the George Floyd murder and subsequent protests, social justice, social activism that came out of it, and you've had a very successful year for you. How are you dealing with the fact that you've had a successful year and it's continuing to be successful, but the backdrop of just like the weirdest year probably of your and I's life?
Yeah, as the country burns, right?
In a way, yeah.
Yeah. It's, in one way, with the corona pandemic, that was super sort of like dystopian. I'm a big science fiction fan anyway. I've watched and read like Octavia Butler, and I'm a Trekkie and all that kind of stuff. But when this happened and it was real, then I got kind of not as interested in science fiction or those apocalypse movies. And then the racial reckoning, or after George Floyd died, I mean, it's rough because it's kind of like, as a Black person, this has always been happening. The only difference is now that white Americans and the international community, let's say like even Black people in Africa and the Caribbean, Europeans, the rest of the world in Asia, they're looking and saying like, this is not right. While Black Americans have been saying it's not right, and white Americans, I'd say, but not the majority. And now that that's changed over, I wouldn't say that it's different than before. I guess that's why my art sort of addresses what's happening, because I was already addressing that Black people should have positive imagery and should feel proud and should speak about the people who we want to honor, whether it be like ordinary people or like Black figures who've been ignored throughout history. Even well-known figures, sort of well-known, like let's say you think of Martin Luther King as well-known, but then when you start reading some of his writings outside of the I Had a Dream speech, you realize he wasn't, yes, he advocated peace, but he wasn't like this man who wasn't a fighter. And he wasn't a man who wasn't killed by racists before he was even 40 years old. So it's just, it is a strange thing to be successful in a time when a lot of people are struggling. But I feel like this has been such a long time coming.
Yeah. I also feel like your work there was like a premonition to it, because in a way the quilt is kind of like a monument, because it's so it lives throughout history in a very interesting way. And I guess I'm curious what your connection with the quilt was and is as you've gotten older. Maybe how it's changed even since you were younger and you were starting to work with textiles when you were at Howard, correct? You were at Howard?
Right.
I have the issue right next to me, and I'm like, wait a minute, I want to double check that. But yeah, like how is your relationship changing to these, I think, monuments that you're making?
I guess, well, my relationship to the quilt in the first place, when I first started switching over from paint to quilt, I started like gluing on pieces of fabric. And I was trying to finish out my degree, but I was pregnant my last year in college, and the smell just made me so sick that I really thought art was over for me. So I just designed clothes, and I made like baby clothes and clothes for my friends. And then it wasn't until I went to grad school I made like a little tiny quilt, like an oven mitt size, that my professor had said, make a little like sampler. And then I was like, oh, like I can make art with my love of fashion and my love of fabric and my training as an artist, and combine those two. And I felt like I understood then sort of the lessons that my mother and grandmother taught me. They weren't quilters, but they were seamstresses, and just like slow processes, sewing by hand, sewing on the machine, like making things yourself, that do for self thing. I felt like that is why especially Black Americans started making quilts. You know, they needed warmth. They needed the community to help. They probably, one person alone didn't even have enough scraps in their own home. You know, it had to be like everybody's scraps in the neighborhood to make that quilt for the family. And then you move on to the next family, and then those scraps are sort of like communally added in, and then you make quilts for that family. So everybody in the quilt circle, if we were all sitting around in a big circle, one by one, the big quilts that we're working on will go to each member in the circle until everybody has enough. And I feel like I used that communal thing, but it was more like through the generations. My mother's fabric, my grandmother's fabric, their knowledge, my professor's knowledge to make these quilted artworks. And I think it's changed over time because I've been more specific. I have to be more deliberate. You know, I can't, I can only make about 25 pieces a year. So I have to be really deliberate about who I want to portray. You know, because each piece might take me a month. So that's, you know, or 2 weeks to a month. That's a serious time commitment. And I want to be certain what I'm saying is the right thing, because I want to help Black people, not hurt them. And I have to be very careful. What if I said something or put something out there that some child saw somewhere and felt bad about themselves? That would be like the antithesis to everything that I believe in.
Has that happened?
I don't think so. I hope not. I hope not. I'm a mother of two, and then I taught high school art for 13 years in a public high school. And I guess like that teacher sensibility, I used to always keep it in my mind. The first rule was like, do no harm, you know, and that meant for any kid in my classroom, regardless of their gender, their sexuality, their race, their size, whether they're popular or unpopular. I just had to be very careful. I never wanted to hurt anybody's child by something that I inadvertently said or did.
And that's interesting because the art world is all about, in some ways, the art world can be a place where pushing buttons is the reason of being. I guess so this is interesting because I'm thinking, okay, you leave Howard, you're thinking about make your textiles is something that you're interested in, quilts. At the time, I am assuming that Black America isn't being represented in the art world in ways that's really as robust as it is right now, and changing and evolving. And also, you're doing something that's a little like outsider art.
Yeah.
so like you're kind of you're coming at the art world in such an interesting, unique fashion. Did you think that, okay, I have to convince people what I'm doing is fine art, or was it something that you started finding like-minded people to kind of navigate your way through this? Because it seems to me that quilts could be slightly a hard sell to somebody who doesn't quite get it.
Right. I mean, exactly what you're saying. Painting just wasn't it for me. I tried, the expression of it. It was like, I guess if you can imagine somebody who's a hologram compared to somebody who's a real human being, like that's what my paintings look like next to my quilts. They didn't have the substance and they didn't have the meaning. And so I didn't have a choice. And I was rejected at first. I had black gallerists and white gallerists just tell me, like, this is not art. This is not fine art. All right, this is a craft. And then I was told, as far as African American quilts go, there should be abstract, non-representational, sort of improvisational quilts, like the Gee's Bend quilts.
Oh, wait. Oh, that's interesting. Why? Do you know why that was being...
They had that set mindset. Gee's Bend, the quilts of Gee's Bend opened, I think it was 2002 at the MoMA, and it traveled the world. Yeah, I guess I have to look that up to get it right.
But that's it's interesting. I'd never heard that abstraction in quilting was something that people like. That's, I don't know. I guess that makes sense in a.
Their aesthetic, but it's silly to say, like, this one section of the country, Gee's Bend, they created these more abstract quilts. But the quilts before them were about pattern, shape, and having that, they had like mirror image of colors and mirror image of designs, repetitive.
Mm-hmm.
But even in that, it was saying, like, my work doesn't fit the aesthetic. I had a gallerist tell me that. I think it was early 2000s. He was saying, African American art right now, the art scene, pictorial images, realistic images, that's not it. And then, so you don't fit in the painting, and then you also don't fit in the quilt world. And I think he just stopped, and he just looked at me, and he was like, well, I just don't really know how you fit in at all. And I was like, wow, well, I guess I'll pack up my portfolio and leave. It was rough. I cried that day. I remember that I cried. I was like, but it wouldn't make me stop doing what I was doing, because I got a lot of approval and support from my community. My friends would come over and be like, will you make one for my mom? I think every single one of my friends has at least 2 or 3 pieces of mine. And they would pay me like small amounts, but that's what supported me.
It's interesting because I had spoke with the gentleman who runs the Outsider Art Fair earlier this year, and we were talking about quilts and kind of outsider art. And then when we were setting up this issue, I, for some reason, never really considered you an outsider artist, but I think a lot of people would, based on. But it's kind of weird how that word itself has evolved so much in the last 20 years to mean different things to different people.
Right. It kind of, I think sometimes they're trying to say that person didn't go to formalized art school.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Maybe they're self-trained, or maybe they worked as an apprentice, but not even. Yeah. I think they've come up with their own techniques. I think I'm really right in the middle of that. Like, I'm using techniques that were taught to me in school, but the materials I'm using are definitely quilting materials that you would use at home.
Right. So what? Give me a typical research project for you in terms of, okay, I found a figure I want to represent, but also I need to find the materials. Like, what are the steps for you?
Well, I usually start out with an idea. Sometimes I'll see a photo that I like. There's a photo that I love of there are 5 young African-American boys leaning on a car. It's by Russell Lee, and it's taken in Chicago. You know that photo?
No.
Um,
I'll look it up.
yeah, look up Russell Lee Easter Sunday. And that photo, it just really inspired like a whole train of thought for me. Like, what was Chicago like in the 1940s?
Oh yeah, I've seen this photo before. It's amazing.
Right?
Yeah.
And you look at their clothes, how finely dressed they are. You know, who bought these clothes for these boys to look that good, including their hat. One boy has a little boutonniere. Like, so these children are very well loved. So that, it usually starts with a photo that makes me go on like a deep dive. And then I'll read literature that was put out during that time. Let's say I read like Richard Wright, Black Boy, or I read Native Son, so that I can get into the mindset of what was life like. And then I just started looking up all of the photos, you know, how many other photos were taken in the 1940s in the south side of Chicago, and what do they look like? And so then I just choose which ones speak to me. And those boys, being that I was a teacher, like it clicked with me. I know boys like that, little characters who are like looking like the men that they will be one day. And in that photo, only the boy in the center was ever identified by name, even though that's a famous picture. And his family and his neighbors didn't know that was him until he was an elderly man, and some people heard about it in his obituary when he died. So, like, if this photo's taken in 1940, some of those boys might be alive now. Why is it that they can't be identified? Mm-hmm. And why can't they have ever gotten any recognition for that photo? Not a dime, I'm sure. Who knows if they ever saw it? I think I heard that the man in the center, or the boy in the center, he saw it in the doctor's office one day in a Life magazine when he was an older man. That was taken in 1940. Those kids go to war?
Yeah, those are crazy stories, yeah.
Where they, I mean, he was a grandfather, but what about the rest of them? So then that caused me to be interested in sort of all of the work that I've been doing lately. Is all of those pictures online. Who are these people and why are they lost like that? Mm-hmm. You know, my mother was born in the 40s, so these people are not literally lost, but they are in a way because they were never told that their photo was famous, or as they would say, went viral, you know, and they never got anything for it.
You know, it's interesting the way that you're talking about this. There's so many different layers of things that we don't care about as much anymore as a culture, which is so sad. Is that first off, even though we have access to research, we don't research that well anymore. I feel like as a society, I just don't think we do. We just kind of tweet and like stuff and just kind of move on. But even just the way you're talking about the clothing and the materials, we used to care so much more about the way we presented ourselves, in terms of clothing, and how important it was to look a certain way when we were out in public, and the attention to detail and the fabrics and all that kind of stuff is something that you are trying to bring back, capture. That's part of the story too. It's just like that, the materiality or just that physicalness of it. So is it hard to find these materials, or are you able to replicate things the way that you set out to?
I think it's pretty easy now, especially because everything can be shipped to your home. You know, I use a lot of African fabric. I use stuff that there's this company in Holland, Flisco. They're one of the biggest producers of Dutch African wax in the world. And so I'm getting it directly from the factory floor. I contacted them, or did they contact me? I think it was equal, but I was so obsessed that I was like, I have to have it right away. I cannot wait for it to go to the store, because what you're making, they'll reprint. They did this fabric called ABCD. They reprinted it. It was made, I think, originally in 1911 in Africa, and people who wore that, it was like a badge of honor. If I'm wearing ABCD fabric, it means I can read and write. And I had to have that fabric. So when I heard that they're reprinting it in all these new colors, I'm like, well, I need to have every color. Because look at my 5 boys in Chicago. Look at how well they're taken care of. These children, their parents care about them and about their education. And I need this fabric for them. So it's been pretty easy to source now. But before it wasn't. I remember like early 2000s how it was like I would have to drive all the way to like some place in the Bronx, or I would drive. Actually, the Amish quilt a lot. I don't know if you know, like the Amish are really into quilting. I would go to like Dutch country and their little shops and get fabric. So now I don't have to like do that much driving around.
Right. Is there something like, what is like your like most sought after material then? Like, what do you like when you like, you're like, oh my God, if I can get like yards and yards of this, like, you know, I'm like obsessed with like, I like, you know, Japanese denim, and I like how the Japanese have taken a lot of classic American stuff and repurposed it and made it into fashion. And, so I get obsessed with like certain brands when they have like this, like, you know, so like, what's your like go, like, oh man, if they have this, I got it.
What am I obsessed with? If there's a commemorative fabric, for instance, like in South Africa, they made a print for Nelson Mandela when he became president. The fabric is called shwe shwe, and they printed it with all Mandela's face on it. No, it was when he died. I'm sorry, when he died. And I got some of that fabric, so now I use it so sparingly. And so I know they did it again when Winnie Mandela died, but I didn't get any of that. If I ever come across that Winnie Mandela printed back, because she's everything. This strong African woman who like held up the movement all those 27 years while her husband was in prison. I've got to get that fabric one day.
I think people don't quite understand, and I surely don't, how each culture treats the quilt. And I thought Jules Dodson, who did your article in Juxtapoz, did such a fantastic job and did some really impeccable research. I want to make sure we shout her out. But I'm curious what you've learned of what the quilt means to different cultures, and maybe how Black America took that and made it their own in a certain way.
What I've learned, well, I have, as far as I have traced the quilts, it looks like they started in Europe. You know, what people needed to be warm, but then also it seemed like they were for wealthy people, where they would do these beautiful, intricate, like hand tapestries and hang them on their walls in those cold stone keeps. You know, who knows? But in northern England, places like that.
So like literally non-functional quilts, like stuff that was more decoration.
It was decoration, but I think those people, also for the wealthy, then there was such a big gap between the poor and the rich that even when they did have this hand embroidered tapestry quilt, they would lay it on their beds as well. They may have another one. And while the serfs probably had nothing, maybe, or maybe they had like some little rough woolen blanket. And then I did see them used as commemorative pieces in Africa, in Benin, but they would be like sort of like a flag that you would drape at a funeral or on the walls of like a place where you're doing religious or like state events. But it always seemed to have this idea, even in Africa, that this was a special thing for wealth or for privilege. And I feel like in America, when it came here, it still was the plantation class, you know, wealthy, who would have a quilt. But very soon after, you know, the African-American enslaved people needed to stay warm too. So they had to find a new way to make these quilts. You may not be able to do the elaborate designs that the master may have on their bed because you don't have that matching cloth. So what are you going to do? And you could fall back on designs and symbols that you used in Africa. You know, and even on plantations as we became American, right? But when we first got here, we were still African and had our African traditions. And so you hold on to those, they pass those on. And in places like Gee's Bend, I think that's why people say, like, this is the African-American aesthetic.
Right. Okay.
Because Gee's Bend was separated from the mainland, those people were the marginalized of the marginalized. They even had their own language. The Gullah language is more Africanized. And they were able to hold on to those traditions more. Mm-hmm. So even though that is a valid tradition, it doesn't mean that new things aren't happening, but that became like the aesthetic out of necessity and out of memory.
And that's where the abstraction comes in.
Yeah, I think the abstraction came from the elders remembering what they did in Africa. What did those commemorative images look like? Even the cloth, there's this type of African print cloth called kente cloth, where it has like strips. Mm-hmm. I mean, but they do go in a pattern, and then they'll have like a perpendicular strip going across it. But those abstract quilts, when you compare them, they look like those African weavings, except for you're using a totally different material in a totally different place for a totally different meaning. I mean, in Africa, they didn't need a quilt to stay warm.
Right. What was the word art like for you when you were a kid? Did you have art in the house? Because I had to do it all on my own. I didn't have a lot, like my parents were not artists. They had no idea. I mean, we knew like the home run hitters of the art world, but I didn't know much.
Right.
So when I did, but like, so for you, what was art like as a youth?
Well, it's funny. I think I misinterpreted when you said that at first. I thought you meant art, like the art I made. My parents were not art collectors either.
No, but that's perfect. No, it's not even about collecting. It's just like, did you have? Yeah, exactly.
My mom let me draw on the wall. I remember I drew these huge, like, big-headed figures on my bedroom wall. You know, when little kids draw.
Where was this?
This was in Plainfield, New Jersey at the time. Okay. But my room, you know, when little kids are at that stage where they draw a giant head and it just has arms and legs sticking out of it, but there's no body? I had drew, like, at least 15 of them, as big as I could, which was life size for like a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, on my wall. And I remember I told my mother those were my guardian angels, so she let me keep them there. But my mother was very like permissive, very progressive, very delicate. She was a very 70s mom, always like cooking with all sorts of natural ingredients and like she enrolled us in this school called Children of the Rainbow. It was deep 70s. Right. Deeply 70s.
You know, it's interesting because I would think that deeply 70s thing would be like Northern California where I grew up, but I'm happy to know that deeply 70s existed in New Jersey as well.
It had come all the way to New Jersey. I think she would have fit in really well in the whole, like, Portland, Northern Cali, like, for sure. Yeah. For sure. I spent half of my childhood just drawing, painting, coloring. I went to a school where you didn't have class.
Wait, what was the name of this school again?
Oh, Children of the Rainbow. Just
I just had to hear that.
Idea. It was just a big house. You could go in what room you wanted to that day. So if you wanted to do art all day for a year, that's what you would do. Because they figured,
wow,
you could stay there till 8th grade. They assumed and figured that you would go to the math room when you felt like it. And if you didn't know how to read and you were like 8, you will read when you felt like reading.
This is like actually kind of how school should be now, considering people are like in some weird social distance learning. Right. How often did you go to the math room?
I went sometimes, barely. I spent all my day in the music room and the art room. My sister spent time in the math room. It was a different time.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
If it was raining, the lesson of the day was take off your shoes and socks. We're all going to splash in the mud. That was what we did that day. The whole day.
I hope listeners can see my face right now because it's like a little jaw dropped, but also just like really, I feel like I missed out.
Well, my father didn't like it at all. He took us out. My parents divorced, and he put us in public school. So that was the end of my time at Children of the Rainbow.
Okay. All right. And then, so then you had to catch up in math when you got to public school.
Everything. I remember I was so like shell-shocked. I was not used to the conformity of public school, how you just stand in line for lunch. I remember like taking at least 2 weeks just staring and looking at the other kids, what is happening? And everybody had those styrofoam trays. You get your chocolate milk and your sandwich and your apple. Nobody was cooking in a big kitchen, and we weren't all having chili to eat in a circle. Like, it just was totally weird to me.
Do your kids go to a school like the circle eating chili school?
No. No. I don't know where those schools are now. I guess they have cooperative schools. But my youngest daughter is a sophomore at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. And my oldest daughter is getting her master's in arts management at Pratt as well. So.
All right. So it is. Congratulations. That's amazing for both of your children. But I guess it goes to show that you can go to public school and still do artistic, cool stuff.
Oh, yeah.
It's possible.
I mean, I grew up in Maplewood, New Jersey. The public schools are good. We had a lot of creative things happening there. SZA went to my high school 20 years later, though. I was in high school with Lauryn Hill. So there are a lot of creative people in the school. We had tons of art classes and music classes. It was an interesting place, and that's why I ended up teaching, and that's where I retired from teaching 3 years ago.
I have to ask one Lauryn Hill question then. Has she bought a quilt from you at any point?
She has not. But she did put me in a special exhibit that she had. I think it was like 3 or 4 years ago. She had She had a show at the King's Theater in Brooklyn, and she had She made the lobby into like an art festival, and I think it was like 3 or 4 days. And so she made sure that I was featured in the festival. And she's definitely looked out. Like, she's connected me with Mokata Museum in Brooklyn as well. So. Okay. She definitely looks out. She looks out.
Cool. She was a big part of my high school life. The Fugees' The Score album was one of my all-time favorites, and I still play it. Actually, I probably play it more often than I play a lot of things, now that I think about it. So it's still so good.
It lasts. Like, you could play that for anybody now. They would not know that album was that old at all.
No, not at all. And I guess, she went on to Miseducation and superstardom. So that was 4 years ago. So what was for you kind of like the breakthrough moment? What was the moment where you were like, this is now, you said you retired 3 years ago from teaching? Is that what you said?
That's, my breakthrough basically was when I met Claire Oliver. I feel like my artwork was already there and I was developed, but I didn't have the audience. I didn't have mainstream exposure. I was showing and exhibiting at Black-owned galleries and at majority Black art fairs. But as far as mainstream exposure, it was nothing. And I met Claire Oliver 3 years ago through Facebook, actually. She saw my artwork at Howard University. It wasn't an auction, but it was a special show where 50% of the profits was going to Howard University in Harlem. And Claire saw my work there and contacted me. And the big breakthrough, I think, was when I did Miami Art Basel for the first time. I can't remember if that was 2017. I think it was, but it was December, so it was right about to be 20 years.
Yeah. It's interesting because as you visited your, I guess, mid-career retrospective this summer. Did it open this summer? I'm getting a little confused with the pandemic timing.
Yeah.
I know we kind of talked a little bit about re-seeing your work, and especially re-seeing your work in a way that's like you see the final pieces, you see the size, and it's like, what can you take from like the last 4 years as you now kind of have had such a fantastic 2020? Like, what's getting you motivated and excited moving forward right now?
Moving forward, I guess I feel like even though this past 3-4 years there's been a lot of things going on, but I've been waiting for this, I feel like, my whole life. You know, the chance to see who else would like what I'm doing. I've never done I did one international art fair. I did Art Fair 154 in London last year, but I haven't had any exposure really to the European art world at all, and Africa either. You know, I get inquiries from people saying, you know, like, come to South Africa, and I'm like, it's not that easy. You know, I would love to experience that, and I had an offer to do like an exhibit in India, but I feel like it was March. I think it was March. And that obviously just didn't come to fruition, but I'm looking forward to seeing how much more can I do. I have so many images on my phone and on my computer of people who just been left behind. Like, if I could do just a little bit to say, like, these people existed, you know, there were well-rounded, proud, and dignified Black people, even way back in the 1930s, or even in the 1850s. Like, if I could at least show that, then I'll feel satisfied.
You were saying that you had been showing with Black-owned galleries, and that was the majority of what you were showing at the beginning. Is that, you know, I can only speak for where I work, and that's in the art world. I can't speak for the greater world because that makes me so upset all the time right now. One of the positive things that could happen this year is that the not only the Black curator but the Black-owned gallery will get the recognition and the recognition for all the hard work and the things that they do behind the scenes to help artists out. As shitty as I will say it, as shitty as this year has been in so many ways, can we get any are there any sort of positive narratives that we can start establishing as we move forward, no matter what happens in November? In the art world. I'm going to just say in the art, because I can't speak for the greater world.
Right. I mean, in the art world, even the fact that you featured me on the cover of your magazine, and I have that huge 10-page spread written by a Black woman writer, you know, that's doing something. We just want to be included. Right. We want to be a part of this American system that we're in. The Black-owned galleries, they are living and thriving without the help of the mainstream. And so in order to break that down, then they have to be included. They have to be. You know, when I first came out, people were saying, with Claire, they were saying she's an emerging artist. And then Claire Oliver was sort of correcting that narrative, like, she's not emerging. She's been exhibiting and working for the past 20 years. But just because I was exhibiting in a segregated Black art scene doesn't mean that I didn't exist at all, or that scene is not as valid.
You know, it's interesting, and as going through this summer, I wasn't sure what our magazine's function could be in a way that was going to be positive. And as much as we had been inclusive over the last, especially like the last 10 years, I think I didn't realize the power of being inclusive really was. Does that sound kind of, I don't know. It's something I'm learning every day a little bit more about being, or just like feeling comfortable to be more inclusive. I don't know. It's like, it's a weird thing to kind of realize our magazine's function can be like that.
It's interesting that, we get used to what we think of the status quo, and you think of it as standard without realizing that so many of the things that we've been taught and the way we do in this country are just Eurocentric, period, and cutting out Black people. And I think it is important to make that stand, like, I want to be actively anti-racist, instead of just saying, like, oh no, we're good. But I think this time of reckoning, it's good to make businesses say, no, how many Black people do you employ?
Right.
How many Black businesses do you help? Let's say if the business is more successful, and making people look at themselves and count, so that it can be more deliberate. Because if we just let it happen, it's just going to fall back into the standard.
And is that one of the reasons why you, in your work, you feature icons and then also just everyday people? Because it kind of helps create a history that is more authentic?
Right. I think that we're always, we love and admire icons because these are the people who are extraordinary. But what about just the ordinary people? Why are they not deserving of respect? I think about people like George Floyd. Some people want to say, well, oh, he was this or he was that. He wasn't good, as if to say, like, he didn't deserve to live.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, like, it's important to just recognize that we're all valid and good people. You don't have to be famous, and you don't have to be doing anything extraordinary to say that this person lived an honorable life.
And I think one of the things I thought Jules did so well in the article was kick off with that kind of anecdote about Frederick Douglass and talking about him as kind of this almost like a contemporary attractive man. I don't know, I thought that kicked off that article, and I hope people read it. It's on juxtapoz.com. It's in our shop right now. I thought that was one of the most effective things we had in the issue, this issue. I thought it was so wonderfully done.
I love the way she did that. And I think, like, you're tapping into something that I rarely ever talk about, but I am trying to, like, even the playing field between not just famous and ordinary, but even somebody from 200 years ago. And we, as people who are living now, I don't want us to think that they're on a different plane. I know that they're physically not alive, but he's a man, was a man, and we are people. Now, we're on the same level. When I make my quotes, I want them to be life-size, so it's almost like he's back.
Right.
And now you have to deal with him not as this, like, dusty figure from a book, or this, like, high and mighty figure even that you can't address. But he's just like us. So now what are we going to say? What is the reckoning? And how are we going to speak to this man to say, those things you were fighting for, well, it's still happening now.
I'm such a fan of your work. I'm so happy you're on the cover. It's like one of the most beautiful covers. It's like we're selling them like crazy in our web shop right now. So that's a really great thing. And, I think being an independent media company, being an independently family-owned magazine, like, it means a lot to, like, be able to tell a unique part of the art story, but also American history. And I'm so happy you made time to talk to me today. I know we had planned this. We kind of were juggling some time, so I'm so happy.
I'm absolutely thrilled, Evan. You don't know. And my daughters they've told me, like, now officially I have made it. Just so you know. Because Juxtapoz is the coolest of the cool. They say all the time in their classes, their classmates will drop it, like, oh, I was reading the new issue of Juxtapoz and blah, blah, blah. So they cannot wait to be like, well, actually, my mom is featured in the new issue of Juxtapoz. Like, bam.
Well, that makes me happy because we do want the art school kids. I do often when I'm editing, I think, like, what's the kid at Pratt or the kid at RISD or even the kid that's, like, in junior college? Like, what do they now feel like they can either make it or, like, they understand it in a way that's different than maybe what the PhD essay is all about. I don't know. I always think like we want everyone to be able to read it, but I'm so happy your kids think that's cool.
They love it. I am absolutely thrilled. I am shouting it from the rooftops, and you know, this has really made, this is, I guess basically this is like the icing right now for me.
Thanks again to Bisa for sitting down with us. Be sure to give her a follow online. We'll put all the links to her socials in the description. We'll be back with you guys real soon. Till then, take care of yourselves and each other. Peace.